Good morning and welcome to Infinite Coffee with Michael and Deanne Goss. Thank you for joining us as we explore our infinite nature and gain practical understanding of how to utilize more of our infinite potential. Now, to learn more about these concepts or just to connect with us, please visit infiniteceo.com. That's infiniteceo.com. So we have our coffee, we have a great book, and now we have you. Today we are beginning the Dore Lectures on Mental Science by Thomas Troward. Now, Troward is easily the most thoughtful and impactful mental scientist of the modern era. So buckle up, this is gonna get deep. Chapter 1, Entering into the Spirit of It. We all know the meaning of this phrase in our everyday life. The spirit is that which gives life and movement to anything. In fact, it is that which causes it to exist at all. The thought of the author, the impression of the painter, the feeling of the musician, is that without which their works could never have come into being. And so it is only as we enter into the idea which gives rise to the work that we can derive all the enjoyment and benefit from it which it is able to bestow. If we cannot enter into the spirit of it, the book, the picture, the music are meaningless to us. To appreciate them, we must share the mental attitude of their creator. This is a universal principle. If we do not enter into the spirit of a thing, it is dead so far as we are concerned. But if we do enter into it, we reproduce in ourselves the same quality of life which called that thing into existence. Now, if this is a general principle, why can we not carry it to a higher range of things? Why not to the highest point of all? May we not enter into the originating spirit of life itself and so reproduce it in ourselves as a perennial spring of livingness? This surely is a question worthy of our careful consideration. You know, one of the things that strikes me as he's talking about that, going back just to the original opening paragraph, he says, if we cannot enter into the spirit of it, the book, the picture, the music, they are meaningless to us. To appreciate them, we must share the mental attitude of their creator. And so, you know, one of the things that we talk about is how do we ultimately connect in with God? And one of the ways is what he's describing, which is to consider God's original intent. What was his frame of mind? What was his goal or his desired outcome when he started the process? And I'm not sure we do that enough. I think many times we don't consider that at all and don't consider what was the purpose and the idea, if you will. Like that's what Troward's talking about here, is the very idea. So just that thought alone, that we would look at it from God's perspective, not just see it from my own point of view. That's a critical part of this equation. And so I'll continue. The spirit of a thing is that which is the source of its inherent movement. Because if we don't understand why he did what he did, then none of the rest of this is ever going to make sense.
Right.
So that's a critical part of this equation. So the spirit of a thing is that which is the source of its inherent movement. And therefore the question before us is, what is the nature of the primal moving power, which is at the back of the endless array of life which we see around us, our own life included? Science gives us ample ground for saying that it is not material. For science has now, at least theoretically, reduced all material things to a primary ether, universally distributed, whose innumerable particles are in absolute equilibrium. Whence it follows on mathematical grounds alone that the initial movement which began to concentrate the world and all material substance out of the particles of the dispersed ether could not have originated in the particles themselves. There had to be a catalyst, because not one of those particles is greater than another. That's when he's saying they're spread and they're in equilibrium. They're all of the same power. They're all of the same material. They're all made out of the same stuff. They're all exactly the same. So one of them can't start something because that would make it greater than the others. Because whatever can start something is greater than the one that can only reciprocate. So none of that, so it has to have an outside catalyst in order for there to be any movement in this ether. It's fascinating. Thus, by necessary deduction from the conclusions of physical science, we are compelled to realize the presence of some immaterial power capable of separating off certain areas for the display of cosmic activity and then building up a material universe with all its inhabitants by an orderly sequence of evolution, in which each stage lays the foundation for the development of the stage which is to follow. In a word, we find ourselves brought face to face with a power which exhibits on a stupendous scale the faculties of selection and adaptation of means to ends, and thus distributes energy and life in accordance with a recognizable scheme of cosmic progression. It is therefore not only life, but also intelligence. And life, guided by intelligence, becomes volition. It is this primary originating power which we mean when we speak of the Spirit. And it is into this spirit of the whole universe that we must enter if we would reproduce it as a spring of original life in ourselves. Now, in this case of productions of artistic genius, we know that we must enter into the movement of the creative mind of the artist before we can realize the principle which gives rise to his work. We must learn to partake of the feeling, to find expression for which is the motive of his creative activity. May we not apply the same principle to the creative mind with which we are seeking to deal? There is something in the work of the artist which is akin to that of original creation. His work, literary, musical, or graphic, is original creation on a miniature scale. And in this, it differs from that of the engineer, which is constructive, or that of the scientist, which is analytical. For the artist, in a sense, creates something out of nothing, and therefore starts from the standpoint of simple feeling, and not from that of a pre-existing necessity. This, by the hypothesis of the case, is true also of the parent mind. For at the stage where the initial movement of creation takes place, there are no existing conditions to compel action in one direction more than another. Consequently, the direction taken by the creative impulse is not dictated by outward circumstances, and the primary movement must therefore be entirely due to the action of the original mind upon itself. It is the reaching out of this mind for realization of all that it feels itself to be. The creative process, thus, in the first instance, is purely a matter of feeling, exactly what we speak of as motif in a work of art. Now, it is this original feeling that we need to enter into, because it is the fons et origo of the whole chain of causation which subsequently follows. What then can this original feeling of the Spirit be? Since the Spirit is life in itself, its feeling can only be for the fuller expression of life. Any other sort of feeling would be self-destructive and therefore inconceivable. Then the full expression of life implies happiness, and happiness implies harmony or peace. Harmony implies order or structure, and order implies proportion, and proportion implies beauty. So that in recognizing the inherent tendency of the Spirit towards the production of life, we can recognize a similar inherent tendency to the production of these other qualities also. And since the desire to bestow the greater fullness of joyous life can only be described as love, we can sum the whole of the feeling, which is the original moving impulse in the Spirit, as love and beauty. The Spirit finding expression through forms of beauty in centers of life, in harmonious reciprocal relation to itself. This is a generalized statement of the broad principle by which spirit expands from the most innermost to the outermost, in accordance with a law of tendency inherent in itself. It sees itself, as it were, reflected in various centers of life and energy, each with its appropriate form. But in the first instance, these reflections can have no existence except within the originating mind. They have their first beginning as mental images, so that in addition to the powers of intelligence and selection, we must also realize that of imagination as belonging to the divine mind. And we must picture these powers as working from the initial motive of love and beauty. So love and beauty are at the base of everything. That was the original intent. And so if we ever find anything that is not love, it's not beauty, then it's not God. It's really that simple. And when we find that in our lives, if we will work to eradicate that, if we'll work to bring order into our life, these are all principles of God's creation. And the more we're in alignment with it, the more we get the benefit of all that. Now, this is the spirit that we need to enter into, and the method of doing so is a perfectly logical one. It is the same method by which all scientific advance is made. It consists in first observing how a certain law works under the conditions spontaneously provided by nature, next in carefully considering what principle this spontaneous working indicates, and lastly deducing from this how the same principle would act under specially selected conditions not spontaneously provided by nature. The progress of shipbuilding affords a good example of what I mean. Formerly, wood was used instead of iron because wood floats in water and iron sinks. Yet now the navies of the world are built of iron. Careful thought showed the law of flotation to be that of anything could float, which, bulk for bulk, is lighter than the mass of liquid displaced by it. And so we now make iron float by the very same law by which it sinks. Because by the introduction of the personal factor, we provide conditions which do not occur spontaneously. According to the esoteric maxim that nature unaided fails. Now we want to apply the same process of specializing a generic law to the first of all laws, that of the generic life-giving tendency of spirit itself. Without the element of individual personality, the spirit can only work cosmically by a generic law. But this law admits of far higher specialization, and this specialization can only be attained through the introduction of the personal factor. But to introduce this factor, the individual must be fully aware of the principle which underlies the spontaneous or cosmic action of the law. Where then will he find this principle of life? Certainly not by contemplating death. In order to get a principle to work in the way we require it to, we must observe its action when it is working spontaneously in this particular direction. We must ask why it goes in the right direction as far as it does. And then having learned this, we shall then be able to make it go further. The law of flotation was not discovered by contemplating the sinking of things, but by contemplating the floating of things which floated naturally, and then intelligently asking why they did so. The knowledge of a principle is to be gained by the study of its affirmative action. When we understand that, we are in a position to correct the negative conditions which tend to prevent that action. Now, death is the absence of life, and disease is the absence of health. So to enter into the spirit of life, we require to contemplate it, where it is to be found, and not where it is not. We are met with the old question, why seek ye the living among the dead? This is why we start our studies by considering the cosmic creation. For it is there that we find the life spirit working through untold ages, not merely as deathless energy, but with a perpetual advance into higher degrees of life. If we could only so enter into the spirit as to make it personally in ourselves what it evidently is in itself, the magnus opus would be accomplished. This means realizing our life is drawn direct from the originating spirit. And if we now understand that the thought or imagination of the spirit is the great reality of being, and that all material facts are only correspondences, then it logically follows that what we have to do is to maintain our individual place in the thought of the parent mind. We have seen that the action of the originating mind must needs be generic. That is, according to types which include multitudes of individuals. This type is the reflection of the creative mind at the level of that particular genius, and at the human level, it is man. Not as associated with particular circumstances, but as existing in the absolute ideal. In proportion then, as we learn to dissociate our conception of ourselves from particular circumstances, and to rest upon our absolute nature as reflections of the divine ideal, we, in our turn, reflect back into the divine imagination its original conception of itself as expressed in generic or typical man. And so, by a natural law of cause and effect, the individual who realizes this mental attitude enters permanently into the spirit of life, and it becomes a perennial fountain of life, springing up spontaneously within him. He then finds himself to be, as the Bible says, the image and likeness of God. He has reached the level at which he affords a new starting point for the creative process, and the Spirit, finding a personal center in him, begins its work de novo, having thus solved the great problem of how to enable the universal to act directly upon the plane of the particular. It is in this sense, as affording the requisite center for a new departure of the creative spirit, that man is said to be a microcosm, or universe in miniature. And this is what is also meant by the esoteric doctrine of the octave, of which I may be able to speak more fully on some other occasion. If the principles here stated are carefully considered, they will be found to throw light on much of what otherwise would be obscure, and they will also afford the key to the succeeding essays. The reader is therefore asked to think them out carefully for himself and to note their connection with the subject of the next article. So entering into the spirit of it, which is one of my favorite concepts, because that's our first step. So when we start considering our infinite potential, our infinite ability, or maybe that's too big a concept for us to sometimes, or just making progress. The best progress that we can make is to return back, if you will, to what the Creator ultimately imagined for you and me. And so much of the life that people live, and we have as well, by the way, is far below what God originally intended. The thoughts that we think are so far below the thoughts that He intended for us to think. There is a verse in Isaiah that says, "My thoughts are higher than your thoughts. My ways are higher than your ways." Now, nowhere in there does He say,
you can't think them.
You can't think those. That's right. You can't think them or you can't do them. It just says they're higher. And so God's ways are higher. And the first key to this is to enter into the spirit of it. You know, one of the things, and I think this is one of my natural gifts as I'm seeing, because I have the ability to quickly fit into virtually any group. And I haven't ever really, I just thought, well, I'm just wired that way. But the reason I am is I can get into the spirit of what it is that they're doing. So I can step in. If they're playing a game, I can immediately get into the spirit. And when I say the spirit of it, not my spirit of it, their spirit of it, the way they're playing that game or the way they're doing that business. That's one of the things I think that makes me so good at being able to diagnose the challenges that businesses have and how to come up with great strategic ways that fit within the ethos of that company to solve that problem, because I can get into the spirit of it and I can get into it very, very quickly. So I have a natural ability to enter into the spirit of things. And the way that manifests for us in this is the more we understand what God's intent was. And really, when you think about early on, you know, the Bible kind of lays it out pretty clearly, that it was about relationship, it was about communing between the Creator and His creation. That was ultimately what the design was. And until we started thinking wrongly, we were never designed to have a negative or a bad thought. We were never designed to be in fear. We were never designed to be anxious. We were never designed to be able to do anything. In fact, you can see it today. We now know this scientifically, that none of those things are healthy. Our bodies were never designed to live with stress. I mean, it eats the joints. I mean, all kinds of fun stuff. And when I say fun, I mean that very sarcastically. It's not fun at all. We're not meant to live that way. Thoughts, thinking, and breathing, and the way we carry ourselves, I mean, it releases chemicals into our system. Hormones are changed. We turn genetic markers on and off by our thinking. That's what epigenetics is telling us now. And so for all these years, we thought that everything just kind of had its own mind, but in reality, our body is a community of trillions of cells. There's a lot of them. And they're all driven by their environment. They change and they operate based on the environment that they're in. And of course, in the body, that's the environment is the blood. The life is in the blood. And we can change the chemistry of the blood just by what we're thinking. And we know this to be true because there's probably been times when maybe you've been frustrated. How long does it take before I start to feel my head hot and just
immediately?
Yes, that quick. That's how long it takes for a thought to translate into a chemical reaction. It is remarkable how fast our body responds to those things. So as we look to enter into the spirit of this, we have to go back to the understanding that it was never God's intent for us to live in stress, in conflict, in arguing with each other, with ourselves. That's where probably the biggest arguments are, is that the term I like to use, that incongruency between who I am and who I want to be, and then who I'm acting like right now. When those two things are at odds, there's incongruency there. It basically takes the power that I have and it dissipates it. It's like heating two waves and they come against each other and it meshes that out. That's why being authentic is so powerful, because now all of the massive energy, all of it is all going in the same direction and nothing's going in opposition to each other. And so as Troward is talking here about entering into the spirit of what God's purpose was, that has to be at the forefront of our thinking. That has to be initially in our conscious minds. And over time, as we consider and continue to meditate on that, over time, that can become a part of our sub or our unconscious mind. When it gets to the unconscious, that's when life is really good. Because then it's as if the thoughts of lack, the thoughts of conflict, the thoughts of stress, it's like you're not even in the atmosphere with those. And so they don't even come anymore. It's like, where did they go? They were down here. And so as we ascend higher, it's different thoughts. They're lighter thoughts. They're not heavy. They don't weigh us down. They actually bring us up and produce life. And so that's a critical part of this equation. And so as we're going through this, I would ask you, because I know that this is also one of your favorite chapters as well. You love entering into the spirit of it, and just the concept of where we started with this: life, love, and beauty as the original intents of that. So,
well, he lays it out very clearly, at least for me, and he explains Genesis, the first chapter, because when he talks about the divine mind, and divine mind is intelligent, and actually divine mind is intelligence.
yes.
And so I kind of in the past have had this vision of God, and he's kind of like out there, and it's kind of hard to define God and spirit. But this makes sense in realizing we're made in God's image. And so we think thoughts and have thoughts, and things are produced as a result of our way of thinking. And that's what Spirit did before Genesis 1:1 and before any of the cosmos existed. So Spirit, because God is Spirit, had to have thought this in spirit mind, in divine mind. And that's a whole nother story we can cover another time about how divine mind is, oh, don't say that, that's new age or whatever. Just moving along, Spirit is brilliant and intelligent. And so when he talks about how evolution happened through creation, and what I mean by that is day one, he said, let there be light, and there was light. Like, that wasn't the sun.
No.
Like, that was energy. And then as the days, according to Genesis, went on, then there was water and planets and then plant life and then animal life. So he's describing that, like he was saying here, that's kind of generic cosmos. It's generic, and he thought about it from love and beauty, because he eventually makes man and puts man in this beautiful scenario. But like Troward says, that's when the individual mind, us, man as a being, is the only creature in all of creation that has the ability to think just like Spirit, intelligent, divine. We were built, like he said, to only live in beauty and in love. So he does a really good job of explaining that, and it helps me understand God, Spirit, the Holy Spirit, all of those things in a seemingly, logical way, that I can kind of put a picture around it. Because Spirit's kind of hard to put a picture around.
Well, technically you can't.
Yeah, so
you cannot define infinite. You cannot technically, to define something is to give it finite.
Yeah, finite.
Give it limitation. It's impossible technically to do so.
So when he describes when he goes through this, it just makes sense. Makes a little more sense to me, because I can look at myself or look at man or look at how, I'm thinking every single second of my existence. Like, my mind is constantly thinking. I'm thinking thoughts. How many thoughts?
16,000 to 18,000 thoughts a day. And think about this. Those thoughts, which are, there's energy in those thoughts, by the way. Energy follows thought. So those thoughts, and because of that thinking, those are chemical reactions that are also in the body. Depending on whether that's a good thought or positive thought, then that's producing life chemically in your body. Or if it's a negative thought, that's producing dis-ease or death in the body. So self-talk is another way, or intrapersonal communication. That's what thinking is. It's self-talk. So you see some people, sometimes you ask a question and nothing comes out of their mouth, and it's like, oh, it's because they don't have anything to say. No, it's because they have so much to say, they're not sure what parts of that they should say, because there's so many thoughts that are basically, a barrage of thoughts are hitting them all at one time, and they're not sure which ones they should say, because there's a lot of those thoughts they probably shouldn't communicate.
But see, so God, Spirit, had those thoughts, and they were thoughts of beauty and love, and those are the only thoughts that divine mind has, that the Holy Spirit has, that God has, are of beauty and of love.
Right. And
he changes not. He hasn't changed since the beginning.
Nope.
We're the ones that have changed.
And that's always the way it is. He never changes. For him to change would be for him to cease to exist.
This would all be non-existent.
It would not exist. And that's impossible. we have to change, and we're the ones that have changed, and we're the ones that have created the problem just because of our ignorance and I use the term, an identity crisis. We just don't know who we are.
Exactly.
Or we're afraid to believe that that's really who we are. I think that's where a number of people get to a certain point and they realize, oh, wow,
this is a big deal.
I am something. Mm-hmm. Not because of myself, but because that's how I was made. I was made for something. I was made to be someone. And being a child of God or being a part of that creation is a big thing. And one of the things, I'll just quickly explain this, that in the Dore Lectures on Mental Science by Thomas Troward, Troward is attempting to communicate things to secular people. Anybody that's done any research on Troward understands that Troward was a deeply religious man. He was a devout Christian, believed all the things that, quote, fundamental Christians believe. However, he had an understanding because he was able to see Jesus as a man that was able to ascend to a higher place in life. And he believed, as I do, that Jesus had emptied himself of his divinity so that being on earth, he didn't use his, quote, God powers to do anything. He used power that was available to all men. You say, well, I don't know if I believe that. We'll go back and look at some of the miracles he did. There was one in particular where there was a lady and she had been in a state of she was infirmed for 18 years, and he heals her on a Sunday, or on a Sabbath, actually, not on Sunday, but on Sabbath. And a bunch of religious people, I guess they were just following him around, kind of like reporters today. You see TMZ, and TMZ follows these people around, and they're sticking mics in their face, and they're always attempting to catch people making mistakes. So it's like everywhere Jesus went, there was this group of people over there taking notes and reporting it, in the Jerusalem Gazette or whatever on the website down there of what he said and what he did. Everything was being recorded. And so the idea that somehow Jesus was able to do these things and nobody knew what was going on, that's ridiculous, because they were literally following him everywhere he went. The people that loved him and the people that hated him. They were like, it was like he was Howard Stern. They wanted to see what he was going to do and say next. And so in that process of healing this woman on a Sabbath day, the religious leaders found, you messed up here because you're not supposed to do any work on the Sabbath, which Jesus found to be utterly ridiculous, a utterly ridiculous misunderstanding.
Mindset.
Yeah, just craziness that you would think that God would ever be okay with one of his children being in this situation. And then he gets onto those people. So they want to get onto him for healing a person. And he's like, how is it that you've allowed this woman, a daughter of Abraham, meaning someone that was covered by the covenant that Abraham cut with God, which provided for healing, how is it that you've allowed her to be in this position for 18 years, and then you want to get upset with me that I fixed it on the Sabbath? Shame on you. You could have done this. Didn't need me. So not only did they feel ashamed because now he made this woman better, but they could have been doing this the whole time. And that's one of the things that Troward understood, was that Jesus came to be our example, and whatever he did, we can do, and then some. At least that's according to Jesus.
Yeah, he said it.
Greater things than these shall you do, he said. And so he uses terms like the divine mind. That's not a term that I grew up with, divine mind. And I first hear it, I'm like, what does that mean, divine mind? Well, the Bible talks about having the mind of Christ, or having the mind of God in you. That is the divine mind. That's what that is. It's just a different term for it. And so he didn't use religious or church talk, because he wasn't talking to people in a church. He was talking to people who had no knowledge of those things. And so in this, he uses terms like the divine mind. He'll use like first cause. There's a number of terms, intelligence, that we start to think of, and that we are products of that. We are. And I like what you said there, that he doesn't have intelligence. God is intelligence. And because we are created in his image, in his likeness, we have access to that intelligence. We have access to the divine mind through our mind. But we have to open ourselves up to it, and we have to allow that to happen. And so that's a big part of it. And that's one of the reasons why I love jumping off into the Dore Lectures with this particular chapter, is because now we're getting into the spirit of what God originally intended for you and for me and for anyone out there that's listening to this. What did he intend for us? And he never intended for us to ever have a bad day. He never intended us to fight with each other. He never intended for us to struggle. He never intended for us to have to struggle and sacrifice. Those concepts are not concepts from God. Those are concepts from God's enemy. And our enemy, the enemy of our soul. Those are negative, low thought processes that just have no basis in the reality of what God did for us. Because why on earth would God ever go to all the trouble to create and provide everything that's been provided for, and then say, okay, now you need to go struggle? I mean, there's a verse in the Bible that says, how, if you, an earthly parent, know how to give good gifts to your kids, how much more does God in heaven know how to give you good gifts? How many of us would create the environment? We have children, you and I, we have 4. Which one of those kids did we decide, you know what, this one's going to have to work. This one's going to need to struggle. Now that one, yeah, that one's going to get all the goodies. And this one over here, yeah, they're not going to have any food. They're not going to have any clothing. They're going to have to struggle their entire lives. And, oh, they might get eaten by a bear. Why? Well, I need to teach them a lesson. Well, they got out of line. Let's smack them around. Let's throw them. Let's make the rest of their life miserable because of the one thing that they did when they were ignorant. On what level does that make sense for anybody? And so if I, a natural parent, wouldn't consider those things, why in God's name have we given God the responsibility of that? And that's just one of the things that I think is just ignorance on fire when people talk like that about God. They just don't have any concept or understanding of who God is, and more importantly, who we are.
Right.
Because the reason those situations are where they are is because of us. It isn't God. It's our lack of understanding that has allowed those things to occur. And as we start to gain better concept and understanding, now we can start to eradicate those in the areas that God's given us to do that in, right? Which is right here in this earth. And so this seems like a great place to end for today. Next time we will pick it up with chapter 2 of the Dore Lectures on Mental Science by Thomas Troward. As always, we'd love to hear from you. So please feel free to drop us a comment. We'd also love it if you would like this show and give us a 5-star rating. Now, if you'd like to learn more, visit infiniteceo.com. That's infiniteceo.com. Thank you again for joining us on Infinite Coffee. We'll see you next time.